All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm chatting with Barr Moses, co-founder and CEO of Monte Carlo. We've been having a great conversation about all things data. And we left off talking about owning who owns data quality and organizational structure is what we were getting into. And so this kind of brings us to another hot topic in data right now, was this concept of data meshes, right? And so to step back, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how, as we have a growing data organization in a scaling organization, company, how we get the benefits of centralization, governance, the consistency, some of the tooling and support, but also not make data a bottleneck and help support this notion that data and quality are owned by the entire company, right? So there's a concept of a data mesh, which it speaks a little bit to various domains owning their full on like sets of data with the data team providing the tools that, in my opinion, without going into 100% of what the data mesh is a little bit still theoretical, right? Like I'm struggling there, but I'd love to understand. I know, a little while back, I actually found the article on the data mesh by something that you posted. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit about what your thoughts are on the future of data organizations, how they scale data meshes.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think this sort of touches on a number of things that we talked about. First of all, data mesh as an idea is actually a very simple idea that also drives or is based off of some of the concepts in engineering, right? So sort of moving from monolithic to microservice architecture. That's sort of a big shift that happened in engineering. And actually, data mesh is simply the corollary of that in data. And oftentimes what sort of I hear kind of from data engineering or engineering leaders who are in data, they sort of, search and think about how to build something like this or how to best kind of organize their company or their team around data. And then they sort of come upon the data mesh and they're like, oh, yes, this is the corollary, if that makes sense. So I think for folks that are familiar with that, sort of the idea of microservices is something that, sort of lends naturally or sort of is easier adapted in the data space. To give a little bit of background for why you would need a shift like this or why this is happening, I think we talked about sort of a couple of trends. One, there's way more people working with data, right? This is no longer sort of a lone data analyst or one or two people working with data. There's actually many different teams and organizations who are using data. And that means that the applications of data are also very different. So you could be using the same data for financial purposes, for marketing purposes, for R&D purposes. So those two things are drastically different than a few years ago. And also the complexity of pipelines and how we're managing data has increased significantly.
The microservice approach definitely makes a lot of sense for data. And so if you move to this kind of microservice or kind of domain-based architecture where teams own a lot more of their data, how do you ensure that knowledge and that skill set is available in all those teams when hiring a data engineer right now or hiring an analyst or data scientist is actually really challenging?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start by saying that I think this concept of sort of data mesh is kind of in its early days, right? So lots of companies and organizations are figuring out what's the best way to do it. There's some great resources online as well. I'll point out actually Intuit wrote a number of blog posts and videos about their sort of journey for data mesh, which I think there's some good sort of nuggets of information and wisdom there. I think there's, to your question on how sort of to solve the problem of literacy and expertise, there's probably a few different things that we're seeing companies do. First of all, as part of sort of the data mesh paradigm, there is sort of a centralized body, if you will, or a centralized kind of infrastructure team that does sort of, first of all, remove duplicate work, right? And also introduces standardization for what are sort of required for the domain specific sort of owners of data, right? The other thing that I've seen sort of companies do is actually be really specific about sort of data literacy, right? And sort of what's required from each team in order to sort of own a pipeline, right? Do you need to have a data engineer? Is a data analyst sufficient? What kind of skills, would that sort of team have to have? What kind of programming languages should they be able to work with, et cetera? And you want to allow for that sort of autonomy and variety. And so it's okay that different teams have different level of literacy, but it's sort of a little bit on the data team to help define what that looks like for the organization.
Yeah, it almost feels like a cultural shift, right? And just much the way that, moving from a monolith to microservices was. And, if I look at it, how microservices went, we almost went too small too quickly, right? We're like, everyone's like microservice for this, for that, right? In this language, we can write it in a billion languages.
Right.
And then kind of things started slowly getting reined in. And it almost kind of seems like perhaps we're on a similar path, right? Where we're going to try a lot of things. And the reason that it's a theoretical future architecture is because we don't really know. We're modeling it off of this stuff, and we're going to have to try a lot of things that are probably going to fail to get to what the future architecture is. But in my mind, there's a lot of value in teams understanding their domain and owning their domain, and the data team providing the tools and the support for that. I'm always looking at trying to balance is like, how do we get the expertise in the domain, but then also have people who look across everything and get that consistency. And it's hard because they're different things, right? And it's really hard to go deep in one area, but then also have breadth.
Yeah, I think there's also a little bit of a function of kind of where the company is in its maturity curve and sort of the data journey, right? And so we actually see that as pretty cyclical as well. So, when a company is very small, there's only a handful number of people in the data organization, it doesn't really make sense to be decentralized, right? When you only just have a handful of people. So obviously that's centralized. And then as you grow, there's, a significant burden on that team when there's so many requests and asks and sort of everything is managed through a centralized pipeline, right? That also sort of stops making sense at a certain point. And then oftentimes you sort of continue to move to be more distributed and experiment with that. And then I think you're right, we're sort of converging towards this like end goal where it's sort of the best of both worlds. We both have, domain specific owners and sort of autonomy for those sort of smaller teams, but we also have a centralized body that helps define what that looks like, removing duplication of work, et cetera.
Awesome. And so I have one other like hypothesis or theory that kind of goes into this that we're taking from engineering and like from product engineering, which is product management, right? Which for a long time, there hasn't been product management on data. And, and I think it's critical, right? Like to understand who the users are, right? To talk about personas, where those personas might be internal stakeholders using data. If you're building a data product for a third party to consume, it might be the users of the data, right? If I had to say, like, if you do anything on your data team, hire a product manager.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it also sort of in our discussion, you can see this, it's sort of a no-brainer, right? It's almost like, how do we not do this until now, yep. Right? And so I really see sort of, data product managers of the product function for data, bridging that gap, right? Helping answer the question of like, who cares about this and why? Yep. And from that, deriving what should we do about it?
Excellent. Well, Barr, thank you very much for chatting with me about data today. And I hope you got to enjoy some of your mimosa. I definitely enjoyed most of my beer here. And thank you all for listening. We'll have more exciting guests as well on the next episode of Tesh on Tap.